Our bonds of love became even more evident in 1919 at Cedar Point, Ohio. This was the first major convention held after Brother Rutherford and his associates had been released from prison. Thrilled to finally gather together safely, the Bible students just kept coming and coming until the entire program had to be moved outdoors, with some 7,000 in attendance. Just 3 years later, in 1922, Cedar Point was the location of an even more exciting convention, with an average daily attendance of about 10,000. It energized God's people to go on preaching with renewed vigor. Many conventions in the years that followed helped unite God's people in even more powerful ways, like the unforgettable one held in Columbus, Ohio in 1931.
Actually, it's Columbus, Ohio. It says so on the photograph.
From Poland to Korea, from Australia to South Africa, conventions were and still are joyful spiritual occasions for all of God's people. They motivate and encourage us, unite us as brothers and sisters, and most importantly, draw us closer to Jehovah.
We've just been watching about a minute and a half of a segment from the November 2022 JW Broadcasting episode. This is the latest installment in the series Our History in Motion, a series that you might say reimagines the history of the organization, certainly whitewashes it, and I've given some pretty good examples of where they've done that in previous episodes. This particular episode, frankly, I just found quite dull, which is why I've only shown you a minute and a half. Towards the end there, what I did find interesting, and maybe Tibor can overlay if he's feeling gracious, it's interesting that you're seeing these images moving past, and interspersed in these images are images of the governing body brandishing Bibles or new releases. Isn't it interesting that even in a segment like this, that's supposed to be educating Jehovah's Witnesses on their history, the modern day governing body need to be front center. We need to remind the followers what we look like. We need to be there in some way. Maybe they didn't individually insist on having their footage shown. More likely, it's just someone in the audiovisual department who's edited this together. But that's the culture, isn't it, of the Jehovah's Witness organization? Increasingly so. This notion that the governing body, not only are they God's channel, but we need to be reminded on a constant basis what they have to say and what they look like. They always used to be in the shadows when I was a Jehovah's Witness, and frankly, I respected them more as a result. It was easier to respect and admire them and view them as wise when you couldn't see them, you never heard from them. You just occasionally might see a photograph in a watchtower, or there was a page in the Proclaimers history book showing their images on one page. And you could admire and respect them because you didn't know what they sounded like individually, and it was kind of mysterious. But now everything's just out there, and not only is it obvious that they're not wise or knowledgeable, in some cases they're frankly clownish and laughable. Not only is it obvious that they're entirely unworthy of respect and admiration, it's also obvious that they can't get enough of themselves. That, quite frankly, this organization is descending into what would be classed, or could be classed, as idolatry. That's how I would have seen things. If this had just been hurled at me 20 years ago when I was a young believing Jehovah's Witness, I'd be thinking, that's not the religion that I know. That's televangelism. It's televangelism when you have preachers making it all about them. So that was one thing I wanted to comment on. The other thing, I'm never going to resist an opportunity to talk about the 1922 Cedar Point, Ohio Convention, because some of you will know that when I first started doing activism, it wasn't under my real name, which is Lloyd Evans, which is the name of this channel. I started doing my activism under a pseudonym, which was John Cedars. And the name Cedars, I'm not going to bore you with the whole story, but it was connected to the Cedar Point, Ohio Convention of 1922, and particularly this photograph. If Tibor can show it on the screen, he would be exceedingly gracious. So there's this photograph, which Jehovah's Witnesses know quite well. And because it's in black and white, or sepia, you don't notice that either side of the stage there are American flags hanging from the, I guess you'd call them pillars of the venue. That would be not just questionable if it happened now, it would be, well, the flags would be torn down. You do occasionally still get flags when Jehovah's Witnesses meet at convention venues, perhaps because it's part of the decor of the venue. But here they're kind of very prominent either side of the stage. And surely, you know, the Bible students wouldn't have been forced to have such a landmark convention in a place with flags that were so prominent if they didn't want that. And this indicates that the organization back then was completely different, had a completely different attitude towards nationalism. So you have these prominent flags either side of the stage at this early landmark Jehovah's Witness convention. And let me now show you some footage from the Faith in Action Part 1 video. This was released a number of years before JW Broadcasting. But notice how they doctored their reenactment of this famous landmark convention.
On September 8, 1922, another convention was held at Cedar Point. Here, Rutherford gave what would become perhaps his most memorable speech.
Do you believe that the King of Glory has begun his reign?
Yes!
Then back to the field. The world must know that Jehovah is God and that Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is the day of all days. Behold, the King reigns. You are his publicity agents. Therefore, advertise, advertise, advertise the King and his kingdom.
No flags. The flags have gone. Even though they have the opportunity, if they were being honest and they were being accurate, if they were depicting this event accurately, the flags would need to be there. It wasn't in their interests, though, was it, to show the flags, because that would have raised questions. Better to have them in the distance, in the sepia photograph, and when you're reenacting this landmark convention, this advertise, advertise, advertise convention, better to rearrange it so the flags aren't there. And this actually was one of the things that when I found out about it early on in my kind of awakening process. It really enraged me because it was just so obviously sneaky and dishonest and disingenuous regarding the past of what was supposed to be God's organization. If it's God's organization, this sort of thing should not be happening. You shouldn't have history being whitewashed and history being told inaccurately. But you also shouldn't have the convention taking place in a venue that was bedecked in American flags to begin with. If 1919 was supposedly the year that the faithful slave was chosen, and this convention was taking place just 3 years later in 1922. So I did just want to raise that point. It won't be interesting to everyone. Everyone has their own sort of line of interest, I've noticed, when it comes to things that irritate them, or kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to discovering that they've been lied to, or that the organization isn't what it purports to be. And just because I found this point problematic doesn't mean everyone will, doesn't mean all Jehovah's Witnesses will. But given an opportunity to talk about it with this latest installment of Our History in Motion, don't mind if I do.